In this video, I'm going to walk you through every property available to you as part of Godot's particle system. We're going to go through how to use all of them, and then as a demonstration, we're going to make this confetti splatter effect that you see on the right. In a follow-up video, I'm going to spend less time explaining all the basics, and we're going to go through instead much more quickly about how to make the portal door and the blood splatter effect you see. So part 1, we'll go through all the properties, do the confetti. Part 2, follow-up video, we're going to do the door and the blood splatter. Let's get started. Okay, so if we go to add a particle system to our game and we do Particles2D, we're going to see two things, a Particles2D and a CPU Particles2D. You almost always want to do a Particles2D because Particles2Ds are optimized to use GPUs, so they can use a bunch of optimizations that GPUs have to render lots of particles quickly. If you know you're going to target a platform that does not have access to a GPU or just need to use particles that are based on a CPU instead, you can use the CPU Particles2D. Almost all the properties are the same, except the CPU Particles2D has slightly less features available to you. There's some things you can't do, and it's generally going to run slower on computers that could use the GPU because it's going to be CPU bound instead. So for the most part, stick to Particles2D. That's what we're going to be using today. So I'm going to add a Particles2D to our game, and this is going to be the basis of our confetti explosion particle that we have. But first, let's go through all the properties that you can set on a Particles2D and talk about how to use them. So the first particle that we can set is emitting. This just means whether the particle is emitting or not. You can control this via code to turn your particle system on and off. You can also just show it and hide it as well, but better just to turn it off if it's not, or turn emitting off if you don't need it. Amount is the amount of particles that we're going to have. So in order to actually see this, we're going to add a material to our particle. And this is the core of the particle system in Godot. You need to add a particles material here to start seeing and being able to edit some of the particle properties. You can also control a particle via shader. If you want to write shader code yourself, you can absolutely do that. You can kind of mix the two also, but we're going to just use the user-friendly, the user interface-based particles material instead, so we can look at all these properties in the editor. So new particles material, and you'll see immediately we've got particles that are dropping. So before we edit our particles material, let's keep going through the other properties we have available on our Particles2D. We have time. This is just going to be the larger, anything to do with the lifespan of the particle. So if I bring this down from 1 second to 0.5, you'll see our particles are dead. They go away after half a second. If I do 2, you'll see they go much longer because they're lasting for 2 seconds. We'll just keep it at 1. This amount right here we can change to be 16, for example, and we'll see we're emitting twice as many particles now. If we double the amount, basically Godot's particle emission rate is the lifetime of your particles divided by the amount of particles. So right now, every 1/16 of a second, 1/16, we're going to emit a new particle. And so you can alter either of these two to change that. One shot just means that your particle will only, or your system will only emit one round of particles, or this amount of particles, before it stops, and you have to manually toggle it on again. This is useful if you want a particle system that's totally controlled by code, like a splatter or something like that, that only needs to be emitted one time. We'll keep it off for now because we want to be able to consistently see our updates in the editor. You can set the pre-process property, that's a lot of P's, to make it so that your particle appears as if it's already run in the background. Godot will simulate your particle running for a certain amount of time before it actually runs it. So we won't be able to see this now, but if you had a particle that you wanted to appear midway through its animation cycle, for example, you could use pre-process. Speed scale just multiplies everything about the particle. So if I do 2, you'll see that it still has a lifetime of 1. It's still going as far, but it's basically making it go twice as fast. So the particle is simulating twice as quickly. Explosiveness details whether the particles, at 0, the particles will be continuously emitted at a constant rate, whereas with explosiveness, they'll be emitted in bursts. So if I set, it's a percentage from 0 to 1. So if I set explosiveness to 1, all 16 of our particles will be emitted instantly every cycle. You can't really see it because they're all getting bunched together in this single one, but there's 16 particles in each of these squares. We'll come back to explosiveness later. Randomness is just a randomness that you can apply to the life cycle. So if I do 0.2, again, it's a percentage. Some of the particles will die a little quicker, a little faster than 1 second. And then fixed FPS and fractional delta, you probably won't need to change these. We're not really going to go over them. So let's keep that there for now. And remember, we're trying to make a confetti explosion particle. This drawing stuff, you really won't need to touch this. A lot of this is just for editor visibility. You can change how this blue rectangle is drawn. You can change whether the draw order is based on z-index or the lifetime of the particle, local or global coordinates. Again, you probably won't need to touch those. And then you can actually apply a texture to your particle. Godot uses a basic, just a white square to start. If you have a special texture or a sprite you want to use as a particle and a normal map to affect how light is reflected off it or drawn on it, you can absolutely add those. Again, we won't do it here, but very easy to add. And then instead of a square here, you'd have whatever texture you add. So let's get to the majority of what we're going to talk about, which is our particles material. So if I click on this, we're going to see a whole host of new options here. We're going to try and cover almost all of these, but some will skip because they're just not really that important. So time, this is also just another randomness indicator. It's a ratio you can set. I'm not sure if there's a difference between the randomness here and there. I generally just use the randomness in this initial time section, so I skip this. We'll come back to trail later. Emission shape, you can actually change where your particle is emitting. So right now, all particles are being emitted from a single point, but let's say we wanted them to be emitted from any point within a circle. We could use a sphere here with a radius 1, and we'll see we now have a radius of 1 pixel in each way where particles can emit from. We can make this a bit bigger to see the effect. So a particle could be emitted as far left as -3, as far right as 3, as far up as -3, etc. So we're getting particles emitted not just at a single point. We'll reset this to just be a point for now. There's other ones you can use, like a box. You can add multiple points or directed points, which is really interesting. So you could add directed points, which have points that point in certain directions. You can have multiple points. So say you had like an icicle effect and you wanted dripping from the ceiling in multiple different spots, etc. Lots of ways you could use that. Flags, we won't really talk about these. You can do different things with the y-axis to make them relative instead of tied to your global y-axis. I haven't really used them, haven't really had a need. But now we're going to get into the stuff that's actually matters. So direction is the direction that your particles initially come out. You see, this is a vector, so it's giving a point in space that your particle system is emitting towards. Right now we're at x is 1 and 0 for everything else, so our particles are actually emitting to right here where my mouse is. But the problem is that we have a gravity value set at 98, so it's immediately sending our particles downward. We don't have any initial velocity, but our gravity value is accelerating them. So if I set this to 0, we're not going to have anything because our particles are going to be emitted, but they have no velocity. So we can change that by adding some initial velocity. This is just a initial velocity that you can do. I believe it's just pixels per I don't know, frame or physics frame. So if we do 10 here, we're going to remember our direction is to the right because our direction is x of 1, 0. X is 1, y is 0. So our velocity is going to be 10 in the right direction, and we have a spread of 45. So it will be anywhere from 45 degrees up and 45 degrees down. So we're going to get a little cone that we're emitting in here. If we change our spread to 90, we'll see that we actually can emit anywhere along the y-axis basically here. You can change flatness as well to give a bit of a depth to our particles. It's hard to see that in some cases in a 2D particle system, but you can kind of make how flat the particles appear. But we'll keep our spread to be about 30 for now, and we'll use some other things later on to change that. We're also going to change our direction to be upwards, so we want x of 0, y of 1, so that, y of -1, since the upwards is negative in Godot. And so now our particles are going to be going upwards, and this will be important when we later on start getting our confetti effect. So we can add some of this gravity back in actually. So I can do 20 here, and you'll see that our particles are emitted and then they fall down. So let's add a little bit more velocity here. Let's do 50, and now our particles are shooting. That's too much. But if we set our gravity to 100, that's a little bit more manageable. So now we've got this fountain effect. Even here already, you've got something that if you had a fountain in your game, you could change these particles to be blue and you'd have a nice effect. Let's go back up to our time at the top here and change our explosiveness to be about 0.6. And this will make a little bit more of a burst effect. So remember, with our confetti explosion, this is kind of the effect we want. We want it to burst out, so we want it to be very explosive. Notice that because it's not 1, it's 0.6, there's still a bit of delay. Some particles are being emitted a little bit later than others, which has a nice effect of a confetti cannon exploding confetti out for over a period of time rather than just instantly. So I think this is a pretty nice effect. We've covered how we can use gravity, direction, emission shape, and velocity. Let's talk about some of these other velocities for a second, even though we won't use them. Just as initial velocity sets the velocity of your particles in the direction they're being emitted in, angular velocity sets the rotational velocity of each of each particle. So say we wanted our particles to rotate as they're shot up. We could give a pretty high angular velocity, and now you'll see our particles rotate as they're moving. This is a kind of nice effect, so I think we're going to keep it for our game. You can also apply a bit of randomness to your velocity, so some of them will rotate faster than others, but all as a percentage of this. So some will rotate at 80, some at 120, some at 100, and anywhere in between, since we're using 20% or 0.2 as our randomness value. So you can also, for almost all these different properties, you can use curves to set values that change over time. We will use a curve later on to deal with color, so we'll come back to that. So orbital velocity, this affects, if you set orbital velocity, it'll cause your particles to orbit around their origin. So if I set this to 1, we'll see our particles orbit around the origin here. We don't really want this, but you can use this with a cool effect if you had something like a galaxy, for example, or something that was supposed to orbit something else, or like a, say you've got a spell or something, or a weapon that you want, like a crystal or something to rotate around. You can use this to give like a nice glowy effect to an item. We'll change this back to 0 for now, though. Now we'll talk about some of the accelerations. Linear acceleration looks at, if you set a linear acceleration, it looks at each particle's velocity and it accelerates it and increases that velocity in the same direction. So if I set this to 10, our particles will continue to move faster in whatever direction they're moving in. So as they move down, you'll see they move up more at the start because they're being accelerated. However, gravity is acting against that. But linear acceleration moves your particles, or accelerates them in the direction that they're moving. On the other hand, radial acceleration accelerates your particles away from their origin. So if I set a radial acceleration here, our particles will be moved away from the origin, whatever direction of motion they have. So see how they're moving wider left and right now because they're being accelerated away from the origin here. You can do some interesting things by combining linear and radial acceleration. Generally, I don't use radial acceleration, but there are some interesting use cases where it is useful. Tangential acceleration, on the other hand, causes motion perpendicular to the motion of your particle. So because our particles are going up, if we apply tangential acceleration, it will apply a perpendicular motion, moving it to the right. So because our particles are moving up, perpendicular to that in the positive direction is to the right. So if I add some here, you'll see our particles start to kind of swirl around to the right. So let me add some here, and you'll see how they start to move to the right. Let me add a little bit more so we can see it. You see how it causes them to move over that way, and it's kind of hard to see since we have gravity on now. So let me just change this back to 0. And all of a sudden you'll see that our particles start to have this swirling effect. If we have a lifetime that was longer and we didn't have so much velocity, you'd see them start to move around. If I bump this a little bit or move this to 100, you can see this would come all the way around. So tangential acceleration is really interesting to give kind of swirling effects that increases over time, or to give a kind of swirling velocity that increases over time. We'll remove that for now and reset our gravity to 100. Okay, so we've gone over tangential acceleration, all the different types of acceleration. Damping is how you slow down your particles over time. You can also apply a negative acceleration, but damping is usually better. So if I add a damping of 100, our particles will slow down over time. Gravity will still affect them, but it's going to be fighting that damping. So gravity is kind of a interesting thing. You either want your particles to be controlled by gravity or you don't, is generally what I found most helpful. If you have gravity enabled, you probably don't want damping and you don't want too much acceleration. But if you turn off gravity, then you can use these other properties to give a more custom motion to your particles. It really just depends on what you're trying to achieve. But for now, we want gravity because we want our particles to shoot up and then come back down. So anyway, you can see how damping slows our particles down. It removes their linear velocity while keeping their angular velocity. We see them still rotating. We'll remove the damping for now. Okay. And now angle. This applies a starting angle to our particles. So we'll say 30 degrees, and now our particles will all start rotated by 30 degrees. So this works in tandem with the angular velocity. It just starts them off at a certain rotation. We can give this a bit of randomness here. I'll do 0.5. So our particles will start at anywhere from 15 to 45 degrees because I'm giving half of 30 degrees. So that's 15. So minus 15 and plus 15 of our starting angle. So this just gives a little bit of a more dynamic rotation to each particle as it gets shot out. Okay, a lot of talking. Hope you're still tracking with me. There's a lot to go over with particles, so I've been trying to go fast, but still hopefully explain everything you need to know. Definitely feel free to leave a comment a comment below, or join our Discord server if you have any questions along the way. We're getting to the end. So scale, this is where we're gonna scale, color, and hue variation are gonna be really, really important for our confetti cannon. So we're gonna spend a bit of time on these. So scale just affects how big your particles are. I could change our scale to be 2, or I could change it to be 0.5, and you see it makes it twice as big or twice as small, either way. We'll keep it at 1 for now, but now we're actually going to talk about curves and how to use them. We're going to use curves for our color and for our scale, and you can also use curves, remember, for all of these other properties that you see up here, and you can experiment with those on your own time. So when you create a new curve and you click on your curve material, you're going to see a little graph like this. The x-axis represents time as a relative percentage. So it doesn't matter how long our particle lifespan is, whether it's 1 or 20, this is going to be the beginning and this is going to be the end. X equals 0 is the beginning, x equals 1 is the end of that life cycle. The vertical axis is going to represent the property you're changing, which is scale in this case. And this number is a relative percentage of the scale you set up here. So a y value of 1 represents this value up here, whereas a y value of 0.5 represents half of the scale up here. If I were to change scale to 20, this 1 here is 20, and this 0.5 is a scale value of 10 because it's half of that value. So remember, this curve, this is all relative to the value it's modifying up here. So we can see now, if I take our curve and I select these 2 points here, I can move it up and down to affect how big our particles are at a given point in time. If I want to affect the size of our particles halfway through their lifespan, I would try and move this towards the halfway point on the x-axis. So this means that halfway through our animation, our particles are half size because I have it at 0.5. And this will continue along a linear path all the way to the end. Now let's say we want a little bit more nuance and we want multiple different points throughout. I can right click on our graph and hit add point and move this around. So now we've got something where our particles will get really small and then get big again. So small and then they get big near the end. To make this a little bit more visible, I'll just move this a little bit more to the left. So now you can see our particles get tiny and then get big again. So there are tons of ways you can customize with curves. Another thing you can do besides just moving points is to select the little blue section here. It might be kind of hard to see, but there's a little dot on the end. You can shift and click it to edit the tangent, which will affect the direction, kind of the angle of the line that a point connects to each other with. Oh geez, that was terrible. So anyway, you can just a little bit more ways to customize what you want to do. You can also right click on a point and remove it. So I'm going to just go back to the default and have 2 points, but I am going to make our confetti significantly smaller by the end of it. Maybe about 0.25. Okay, so that's how you use curves. They're pretty straightforward once you get them, but they can be a bit tricky to kind of get a full understanding of. Now we're going to go to color. What we could do is set a default color, like in here, and change our color to something, but we're actually going to use a color ramp, which is a gradient. Gradients are very similar to curves like we just saw with scale. So if I set a color ramp, I can't set a original color. I have to edit it totally within the gradient. So when we create a color ramp, we have to add a new gradient like so, and I'll click on this gradient. And basically, just like a curve, a gradient is moving from one color to another in a linear way. So we start at black and end at white. This is the default gradient, and you can see that in our animation. It starts black and ends white. But we want to use a more vibrant color. This is confetti after all. I'm going to set it to be a bright red, and we will add different colors later on. So we're going to have a bright red, and then it's going to get darker, and I can click on these 2 colors to move them. I can click anywhere to add a new color, and then right click to delete it. So I'm going to have 3 colors. So I want this to be that same red, except darker. So I'm going to bring it down here, and then I'm going to click again here at the end and make this also that dark red, but I'm going to make the transparency much lighter. So the best way to have really nice particle transitions to give a nice fade out effect to particles, there's 2 great ways to do it. One is you can make a color gradient that becomes transparent near the end, like we see here. It gives this really nice fade out effect where your particles just kind of become transparent. Another way, which we're also doing, is to have your particles get smaller near the end. So this is another way that they just kind of fade out. You can use these in tandem like we're doing to get a nice effect, or you can just use one or the other, whatever works for your system. In the next video, we'll go over some more examples to give different ways that you can mess with both those. But for now, this is good. So what I like doing is to make our particles get darker first, so you can kind of see them fading and then fade later on. So I like to have a full transparency or full alpha from light to dark, and then dark to transparent. I think this gives a nice effect, but you can adjust as needed. So now we've got our color gradient and we've got all these red confetti pieces, but confetti has a lot of colors and we need to add all those as well. So the next thing we're going to do is hue variation. Normally, I don't really use hue variation that much, but it's perfect for a confetti cannon. So what hue variation does is it multiplies hue values, or change, I don't know if multiply is the right word, but it changes hue values for all your particles. So I can set it to a constant value of 1, for example, here, and it's going to multiply the hues of all these properties. Oh, sorry, it's a scale from -1 to 1. And when I change this, it's a constant multiplicative. But what if we added some randomness to this? What if I added 0.5, for example? Now all of a sudden, we've got something really cool. So it's randomly taking anywhere from half of this below or above 0 and adding it to our hue multiplication. And if I change our hue variation base value, you'll see that there's even more colors we're able to get. If I change our randomness all the way up and our variation all the way up, we've now got a more full spectrum of confetti colors that will shoot out of our confetti cannon. So this is really cool. I like hue variation a lot when you just want random colors, or you can use very small amounts of hue variation to slightly adjust colors to make your particles look a little bit more dynamic and not always the same. So I think we've got a really good confetti cannon now, and we've gone through pretty much every single property in our particle system. Just a couple more to wrap up. This animation section here, you can actually control and modify your particles from an animation player. These will set some of these like particle animation speed, offset, etc. We're not going to mess with these because we don't have a particle animation player or an animation player attached to our particle system, but they are there if you need them. One other property we didn't go over is trail. And what this does, if you set a trail, basically divisor means how many particles will trail each other particle. Because our divisor is 1, it means that each particle stands on its own. It has no trail. But if we bump this up to 2, it means each particle will have another particle that follows it. And you can kind of see that. See how these particles are grouped together? It also, particles that are within the same trail have the same random values applied. So a particle that's pink, like right there, or purple, the trail particles are also always purple. One thing to note is that when you increase your divisor, it does not change the amount of total particles emitted. It just divides it. So if we have a divisor of 2, it's going to emit 8 bursts of particles, with each of those 8 particles having a trail, or having 1 particle as a trail. So the particle plus the trail is 2, and it's doing it 8 times, which is 16. So again, upgrading your divisor does not increase the total particles that come out. It just assigns them as trails rather than individual bursts. So if I were to bump our divisor up to 4, 16 divided by 4 would be 4. So we would have 4 bursts of particles, each with 3 particles as a trail, for a total of 4 particles in each burst. We'll see that right now. So I bumped this up to 4, only 4 particles, 4 bursts that happen each cycle. And you'll see each particle has 4. This is a pretty cool effect, and trails are really important and helpful in a lot of ways, but for the purpose of a confetti cannon, not totally what we're going for, so we'll set our divisor back to 1. And now, I think we've covered pretty much everything you need to really own Godot's particle system. You can make whatever you want. All of this is totally built in to the particle system. In the next video, we're going to go over a blood splatter effect and a Minecraft Nether Door style effect to really show different ways you can do it totally within the particle system, not using any outside resources. Let's just review real quick all the changes we made to make our confetti system. We've got a particle amount of 16, a randomness of 0.6, or a randomness of 0.2, and an explosiveness of 0.6. And then we are setting our direction to be upwards with a spread of 30, so -1 in the y direction with a spread of 30. We've got a gravity at 100, initial velocity of 50, and then we don't have any other velocity or acceleration values. We've got an angle of 30 with a randomness of 0.5, and then we've got these scales or a scale curve that goes from full size to about 0.25 at the end. And then we've got a color gradient that goes from red to dark red to transparent dark red. And the reason I chose red is just because it's a basic color that the hue variation works really well with, which, speaking of, we just have variation and variation randomness set all the way up to 1. So thanks so much for watching. This is how to use Godot's particle system, and you learn in the process how to make a confetti cannon. What a great way to celebrate. I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, a like and subscribe to support the channel are always appreciated. We'd love to have you in our Discord server. The link to that is in the description below. And if you found my work helpful, donating or buying me a coffee helps me continue to make great content about Godot. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.